Hello, and welcome to an introduction to green algae and land plants. We will focus primarily on land plants during this video, but keep in mind that there's lots of good evidence indicating that plants evolved from algae. And if you think about algae, these are organisms that live their entire lives in water. So a lot of the characteristics that we find in algae are actually retained in many groups of land plants. After watching this video, you should be able to explain the alternation of generations. This is the basic life cycle common to all land plants. You should also be able to distinguish homospery from heterospery, and also you should be able to explain the life cycles of mosses, ferns, and flowering plants. So first of all, this idea of alternation of generations. Again, this refers to the life cycle that applies to all plants that are out there. So as we discuss this alternation of generations, keep in mind that if you learn this basic life cycle, you can answer the vast majority of questions as they apply to any group of plants that exists out in nature. So, alternation of generations refers to this idea that plants alternate between two different phases throughout their life cycles. First of all, part of their life cycles is spent as a sporophyte phase. Sporophytes are diploid, much like most of the cells in our bodies are diploid. Sporophytes refers to spore-producing plants. So sporophytes produce spores by meiosis. As a consequence, the spores that are produced are haploid. So what happens to those spores? Well, it depends exactly on which species we're looking at, but bottom line, it doesn't matter what plant we're looking at, spores always grow into gametophytes. And so gametophytes refer to the haploid phase of the plant life cycle. So plants alternate between diploid sporophytes and haploid gametophytes. Gametophytes, you might guess, are the portion of the life cycle that produce gametes, sperm and eggs. And sperm and eggs, once they're produced, somehow or another they get together, so fertilization takes place. We get a diploid zygote that grows into a diploid embryo. That then grows into a new sporophyte, thus completing the life cycle. So just a few additional comments at this point. Spores, they develop into gametophytes by undergoing mitosis. Notice there's no change in chromosome number here. But also take a look at the production of gametes, sperm and eggs, from gametophytes. Again, notice there's no change in chromosome number. So a common misconception or a source of confusion is this idea that in plants, unlike animals, plants produce their gametes by mitosis. And again, this is a source of confusion because we're so used to thinking about humans and other animals, whereby gametes are produced by meiosis. Well, that's not the case in plants. So keep that in mind, right? Plants produce their gametes by mitosis. The other thing I'll mention at this point is that many people tend to confuse spores with sperm. Keep in mind these are two totally different parts of the life cycle. They do totally different things as part of the basic plant life cycle. Okay, so let's take a few minutes and explore a few major groups of plants. And we'll begin with mosses. You see a few moss plants toward the left here. They consist of a green leafy photosynthetic portion. That's actually the gametophyte. And growing from the tips of those gametophytes are these thin brown structures. Those are actually the sporophytes. Mosses are, we say, are non-vascular plants, meaning they don't produce vascular tissue. They don't produce xylem or phloem, which of course are cells specialized for conducting water and sugars throughout the plant body. So since they don't produce vascular tissue, they just don't grow very large, unlike many other groups of plants that we'll focus on here in just a few minutes. But a few initial comments about mosses. They produce gametes at the tips of their gametophytes. So, for example, toward the center, we're looking down on several gametophytes of mosses. Some of these are male. Those are producing sperm at the tips. Others are female. Those are producing eggs at the tips. So again, they produce their gametes at the tips of gametophytes. And also, much like their algal ancestors, the sperm are motile. They have flagella They also require an external source of water for fertilization to take place. So they need some rain or some dew, something for those sperm to swim through in order to fertilize an egg. So let's take a brief look at the basic life cycle of mosses. Initially, I just want to point out that the gametophytes, recall that's the green leafy photosynthetic portion, we see those here. Those are the dominant phase of the life cycle in mosses. The sporophytes, these thin brown structures, those actually rely entirely on the gametophytes for their existence because they get all their nutrients and so forth from the gametophytes that they grow from. So let's take a look at the key events that occur during the life cycle of mosses. Well, let's begin toward the left here. We see some sporangia or spore capsules, right? That's part of the sporophyte, producing spores by meiosis. So haploid spores are produced, they're released, they might get blown around in the wind for a while. But think back to alternation of generations. Spores always grow into gametophytes. So here we see a few gametophytes. At the tip of some, they'll be producing eggs, and others they'll be producing sperm. So gametes are produced, right, by mitosis, right, at the tops of these gametophytes. And then if there's water present, rain or dew or whatever, then we can have fertilization taking place. So the sperm will actually swim to and fertilize eggs, again, located at the tip of a female gametophyte. Once fertilization takes place, we get a diploid zygote that grows into an embryo, which then grows into a new sporophyte, again at the tip of a female gametophyte, thus completing the life cycle. So that's the basic life cycle of mosses. Again, notice that it's the gametophyte phase. That's the dominant portion of this life cycle. We said mosses don't grow very large because they don't produce vascular tissue. So let's now take a look at vascular plants that produce xylem and phloem, right? These specialized cells for conducting water. And as a consequence, vascular plants can grow much larger than mosses. As an example of an early vascular plant, let's take a look at ferns. So just for context, here's our phylogenetic tree. Here are ferns. So these are seedless vascular plants. They don't produce flowers, they don't produce seeds, but again, they do produce vascular tissue. When you think of a fern, that's actually all sporophyte. And we know that's sporophyte because if you look on the underside of fern fronds, as they grow and mature, they'll often be loaded with lots of these little yellow or brown structures. Those are actually sporangia, or spore-producing structures. So the fern itself is all the sporophyte phase of the life cycle. Turns out gametophytes are these fairly small structures. We see some here, roughly the size of a fingernail. So these are the structures that actually produce the sperm and eggs, right? Again, much, much smaller than the sporophytes. So in ferns, the sporophytes are the dominant phase of the life cycle. So let's just take a brief look at the key events that occur during the fern life cycle. So here we have a mature fern plant. We have these sporangia being produced on the underside of the leaves. And again, they're producing spores by meiosis. So spores are produced, they're released, blown around in the wind for a while, and like all other plants, those spores are going to grow into gametophytes. So it turns out that the gametophytes that are produced are bisexual. So a single spore will grow into a bisexual gametophyte. So it's producing both sperm and eggs. They may be produced at different times, but nevertheless, both of those gamete types are produced on a single gametophyte. So as the gametes are produced, again, much like mosses, the sperm are motile. They require an external source of water. They will then swim to and fertilize an egg. And once an egg is fertilized, we get a diploid zygote, grows into an embryo, that grows into a young sporophyte like we see here, and eventually the sporophyte will grow into a mature fern plant, thus completing the life cycle. But again, notice, unlike mosses, where the gametophyte was dominant in ferns, now we have the sporophyte as a dominant phase of the life cycle. So if you think about this life cycle and think about these spores produced, yes, they'll produce thousands of spores, but they all pretty much look the same, and each spore grows into a bisexual gametophyte. So that illustrates this concept of homospore. So we say ferns are homosporous, meaning they produce just one type of spore. Again, each one growing into a bisexual gametophyte. And if you think about mosses and ferns, they pretty much rely on their spores for dispersal. And that's okay, that works well for them. But is there anything better? Well, now let's talk about the origin of seed plants. It turns out that seed plants required the advent of heterospore. So heterospore refers to producing two types of spores, namely one that will grow into a male structure and one that will grow into a female structure. So one grows into a male gametophyte, the other goes into a female gametophyte. So just a few comments about seeds. Doesn't matter what type of seed plant you're looking at, most seeds have a few key features in common. There's typically some embryo that if the seed is planted, the embryo will grow into a new plant once it germinates. There's also some nutritive tissue, because if you think about it, when a seed is underground, there's no light down there, so that embryo needs a source of nutrients to begin its initial growth before it can poke above the soil and photosynthesize on its own. And then there's also some protective outer seed coat. And we typically recognize two large groups of seed plants. So gymnosperms, this includes things like pine trees, spruces, firs, and other conifers, and a few other groups as well. But then also angiosperms or flowering plants. So angiosperms produce seeds, but of course they also produce flowers. So let's take a look at flowering plants and let's look at the basic life cycle of flowering plants. So first of all, when you think about a flowering plant, it could be a large tree or a smaller flowering plant, doesn't matter. Pretty much most of the plant is all part of the sporophyte phase. So the roots, the stems, the leaves, that's again all sporophyte. It turns out that the gametophytes in flowering plants, thinking they're a separate male and female gametophytes. Again, think about heterospore. It turns out we're going to focus on a few key parts of a flower. So first of all, I'm focusing on an anther here. Within anthers, pollen grains are produced. And it turns out that pollen grains are actually male gametophytes because they're going to produce sperm. There are also these little structures here referred to as embryo sacs. Those are actually the female gametophytes. They develop within ovules. So an ovule is just an immature seed that is found within an ovary. An ovary will eventually develop into a fruit if this flower is pollinated. So embryo sacs or female gametophytes are these tiny microscopic structures that will eventually produce eggs. That's why we say they're female. But again, they develop within these ovules. So separate male and female gametophytes in flowering plants. Again, they're microscopic, tiny little structures. So let's take a brief look at the key events that occur during the flowering plant life cycle. So we'll begin toward the left here. We have anthers and ovules. That's where we're going to have spores being produced. So we refer to these as microspores within anthers and megaspores within ovules. And microspores do tend to be a little smaller than the megaspores. But within the anthers, those microspores develop into the pollen grains or the male gametophytes. In the ovules, the megaspores develop into the female gametophytes because they'll eventually produce eggs. So we have these two different gametophytes growing and developing, again, male and female. And then when the pollen are mature, they'll be released and hopefully pollination will take place. That's what's illustrated over here. So imagine a pollen grain landing on the tip of this female part of a flower. This region up here is called the stigma. But if a pollen grain lands on the stigma of a flower of the same species, it will germinate. It'll produce this long tube-like structure, we simply call it a pollen tube, that will grow down and directly deposit sperm right at the egg. So unlike mosses and ferns, flowering plants don't really require an external source of water for fertilization, and their sperm are not motile. They don't have flagella. It's these pollen tubes that carries the sperm directly to the eggs. So fertilization takes place. Um, Various things happen, but ultimately, if an egg is fertilized, that will grow into an embryo. That's what we see taking place here. This green structure is an early embryo. There's also some nutritive tissue that develops. Some key things happen we're not going to worry about at this point, but ultimately, again, you get some embryo and some nutritive tissue, and of course, your outer seed coat. We then get a mature seed that can then be released, dispersed, and hopefully it will germinate and grow into a new sporophyte, right? Thus completing the life cycle. But I just want to point out here how tiny these gametophytes are. Pollen grains and embryo sacs are these tiny microscopic structures, far smaller, right? Much more reduced in structure compared to gametophytes of ferns and mosses. And if you think about the structure of flowering plant seeds, they can be quite diverse. And of course, they can be produced within fruits. So that then allows seeds and fruits to be dispersed in all sorts of ways in flowering plants. Acorns, for example, right? Lots of animals might be gathering acorns and eating lots of them, but many of them can then, of course, also be dispersed and grow into new oak trees. Some are highly adapted for sticking to animal fur and again being carried off long distances and potentially growing into new plants. Others are highly adapted for wind dispersal, like we see here, and others, for example, coconuts, are adapted for water dispersal. So they can actually be dispersed long distances where they might wash up onto the beach and start to grow into a new palm tree. So that concludes our brief discussion of the major groups of land plants and some of the key events that occur as part of their life cycles.